In December 2018, as the sun rose over the University of Ghana, students and lecturers gathered in quiet anticipation. By morning, a statue that many around the world considered untouchable was gone. Mahatma Gandhi, long celebrated as a global symbol of peace and justice, had been removed from campus. The reason was not vandalism, nor political rivalry, but history itself. For years, petitions circulated among scholars and students, pointing not to rumors or modern interpretations, but to Gandhi's own early writings, words written in South Africa, decades before he became the Mahatma, revealed views toward black Africans that deeply conflicted with the values he would later represent. To many on campus, honoring Gandhi without acknowledging this history felt incomplete, even unjust, especially on African soil, where local heroes and anti-colonial leaders remain under-recognized. The removal of the statue sent shockwaves far beyond Ghana. Some saw it as an attack on a global icon. Others saw it as a long overdue reckoning, a moment when history refused to stay silent. How could the man whose philosophy inspired civil rights movements across the world also have expressed ideas that today are impossible to ignore? And why were these words missing from so many textbooks, films, and popular biographies? This is not a story about erasing Gandhi. It is a story about confronting the full truth, the uncomfortable chapters alongside the inspiring ones. It is about understanding how historical figures are shaped by their time, and how some grow beyond it, while others carry contradictions that still echo today. In this video, we will explore the words that sparked protests, the context in which they were written, and the transformation that followed. If you are ready for history told honestly without myth, without simplification, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This is a story that challenges what we think we know, and it begins right now. To understand why Gandhi's statue became a symbol of controversy in Africa, we must return to the moment when his political journey truly began, not in India, but in colonial South Africa. The young Mohandas Gandhi arrived there in the 1890s as a British-trained lawyer, confident in his education, his manners, and his belief that reason and law could secure justice. When he was expelled from a first-class train carriage despite holding a valid ticket, the shock was profound. That night on the platform did awaken something in him, but not yet a universal vision of equality. What emerged instead was a determination to defend the dignity of Indians who, like him, believed they deserved better treatment within the colonial order. South Africa at the time was governed by rigid racial hierarchies carefully designed to benefit Europeans above all others. Within that system, Indians occupied an unstable position, neither accepted as equals by whites nor granted separation from black Africans, who bore the heaviest weight of colonial exploitation. Gandhi found this classification deeply humiliating. His writings from this period reveal a man fighting not against racial hierarchy itself, but against his placement within it. He argued that Indians were being unfairly reduced to the same status as Africans, a comparison he viewed as degrading rather than unjust. In his letters, petitions, and speeches, Gandhi worked tirelessly to convince colonial authorities that Indians were different. He emphasized their ancient civilization, their religious traditions, their education, and their economic usefulness. These arguments were carefully chosen, not to dismantle the system of racial ranking, but to climb within it. Gandhi's language reflected a belief that Indians could be recognized as respectable subjects of the empire if they were clearly distinguished from the African population. This was not accidental rhetoric, but a strategic approach shaped by his surroundings, his upbringing, and his desire for practical results. For colonial officials, this strategy was effective. In some cases, policies were adjusted not by removing discrimination, but by refining it, creating separate categories that placed Indians above Africans while preserving European dominance. Gandhi interpreted these outcomes as victories for Indian dignity, even though they left the broader structure of inequality untouched. At this stage of his life, the suffering of black Africans remained largely outside the moral frame of his activism, not because it was invisible, but because his struggle was narrowly defined. This focus did not make Gandhi unusual among colonized elites of his era. Many communities under imperial rule sought protection by proving their closeness to European standards, distancing themselves from those deemed least acceptable by colonial ideology. Gandhi absorbed this mindset early, shaped by caste hierarchies in India and by Victorian values he encountered in England. In South Africa, those influences converged, producing a form of activism that pursued justice selectively, advancing one group while leaving others behind. When viewed from the present, this phase of Gandhi's life feels deeply unsettling, especially when contrasted with the moral authority he later embodied. Yet it is precisely this tension that gives the story its weight. The protests that led to the removal of his statue did not emerge from misunderstanding, but from historical memory. They forced a confrontation with the reality that Gandhi's early fight for dignity was not inclusive, and that his path toward moral leadership was neither immediate nor pure. This chapter of Gandhi's journey reveals a man still bound by the assumptions of his world, struggling for recognition within a system he had not yet learned to reject. It is the uncomfortable foundation upon which his later transformation would be built, and without acknowledging it, the story of Gandhi remains incomplete. As Gandhi's campaign for Indian dignity intensified in the 1890s, the moral limits of his early activism became increasingly clear. Having already committed himself to proving that Indians deserved better treatment within the colonial system, he began to adopt the very language and assumptions that underpinned that system. In doing so, he crossed a line that later generations would find deeply troubling. His struggle was no longer simply about resisting discrimination. It became, at times, an effort to reposition Indians higher within a racial order he still accepted as legitimate. Colonial South Africa operated on an unspoken but rigid scale of human worth, with Europeans firmly at the top and black Africans at the bottom. Rather than challenging this structure, Gandhi frequently framed his arguments in ways that reinforced it. In his petitions and public writings, he contrasted what he described as Indian refinement, discipline, and civilization with African ways of life, which he portrayed through the lens of colonial stereotypes common at the time. These comparisons were not incidental. They were deliberate, meant to reassure white officials that Indians posed no threat to European dominance and should not be governed as if they were the same as the African population. At moments, Gandhi went even further, openly acknowledging white supremacy as a political reality he was willing to accept. He argued that European rule should remain intact, provided that Indians were granted recognition and respect above those placed at the bottom of the hierarchy. This stance was not born of admiration for domination, but of calculation. Gandhi believed that appealing to imperial pride and racial assumptions was the most effective way to protect Indian interests in a hostile environment. Yet the cost of this strategy was profound, because it required validating a system built on exclusion and inequality. What makes this phase of Gandhi's life especially unsettling is the clarity with which he expressed these views. His words leave little room for reinterpretation or charitable editing. He did not merely remain silent about African suffering. He actively distanced his cause from it. Being classified alongside black Africans was, in his mind, a humiliation rather than a shared injustice. That distinction shaped his tone, his arguments, and the victories he sought. When policies were adjusted to separate Indians from Africans, he regarded it as progress, even though it left millions of Africans trapped in the same oppressive conditions. These views did not emerge in isolation. Gandhi was a product of layered hierarchies long before he set foot in South Africa. The caste structures of India, the racial thinking of the British Empire, and the Victorian ideals he absorbed during his education all shaped his understanding of social order. In South Africa, these influences merged into a worldview that measured dignity in relative terms, where advancement for one group did not require justice for all. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to dismiss this period as a regrettable detour, but doing so risks oversimplifying the story. The power of this chapter lies precisely in its discomfort. It forces us to confront the reality that Gandhi's moral evolution was slow, uneven, and shaped by compromise. The later icon of nonviolence and universal human dignity did not begin his journey as a radical challenger of racial hierarchy. He began as a man seeking space for his own community within it. This truth explains why Gandhi's legacy resonates so differently across the world. For many in Africa, these early writings are not abstract flaws but direct reminders of a system that justified their exclusion. When statues were questioned and removed, it was not an act of historical erasure, but a demand for honesty. The story of Gandhi, when told in full, reveals not a flawless hero, but a deeply human figure whose early acceptance of injustice would eventually become the very thing he had to unlearn. By the late 1890s, Gandhi had become a skilled political communicator, keenly aware that moral appeals alone carried little weight in a colonial society structured around race and power. Having already accepted the framework of imperial rule, he tailored his language to resonate with those who governed it. Rather than challenging the assumptions of white authority, his early rhetoric often mirrored them, carefully crafted to present Indians as a community worthy of special consideration within the existing order. In his petitions to colonial legislatures and letters to newspapers, Gandhi emphasized what he described as the long and sophisticated history of Indian civilization. He highlighted ancient texts, systems of learning, religious philosophy, customs and commercial discipline as evidence that Indians were not newcomers to organized society, but heirs to a refined and enduring culture. These references were not merely expressions of cultural pride, they were calculated signals meant to align Indian identity with the values that colonial officials claimed to respect, such as order, morality, and historical continuity. One of the most striking elements of this strategy was Gandhi's invocation of Indo-Aryan kinship, drawing from popular racial theories of the 19th century. He suggested that Indians and Europeans shared distant ancestral roots, subtly implying a closer affinity between the two than between either and Africa's indigenous peoples. In the intellectual climate of the time, such arguments carried weight as they echoed ideas widely accepted in imperial circles. By using this language, Gandhi positioned Indians as culturally and even historically closer to Europeans, a move designed to counter narratives that placed all non-white populations into a single, inferior category. This approach did not arise from ignorance. Gandhi understood the prejudices of the colonial state and chose to engage them on their own terms. He believed that confronting white authorities with arguments they already accepted would yield tangible gains for Indian communities facing legal restrictions, social exclusion, and economic barriers. In this sense, his rhetoric was pragmatic rather than impulsive, shaped by a belief that survival and progress required strategic compromise. Yet this pragmatism came at a moral cost. By framing Indian worth in comparison to African societies, Gandhi reinforced the very hierarchies that sustained colonial domination. His language implicitly validated the idea that civilization could be ranked and that proximity to European norms determined one's right to dignity. While his intent was to protect Indians from discrimination, the method relied on distancing them from those deemed least acceptable by colonial ideology. Within this framework, Africans appeared not as fellow victims of empire, but as a reference point against which Indian respectability could be measured. The injustice, in Gandhi's mind, was not that Africans were denied rights, but that Indians were being treated as if they were no different. This distinction shaped his tone and priorities during these years, narrowing his vision of justice and limiting the scope of his empathy. Over time, these arguments achieved partial success. Colonial administrations occasionally adjusted policies, granting Indians separate legal classifications or limited concessions. Gandhi interpreted such outcomes as proof that his approach worked. Yet these changes did nothing to dismantle the broader system of racial inequality, and in some cases, they strengthened it by formalizing new layers of separation. Indians gained marginal improvements, while Africans remained excluded, their position at the bottom of the hierarchy unchanged. Seen in the context of his later life, this phase reveals a Gandhi still negotiating his relationship with power rather than resisting it outright. He was learning how to speak to authority before he learned how to confront it. The language of civilization and kinship, borrowed from imperial ideology, would eventually become inadequate to the moral clarity he later sought. But at this stage, it defined his strategy and shaped the legacy that would one day come under scrutiny. This chapter helps explain why Gandhi's story cannot be told as a simple rise from oppression to enlightenment. His early rhetoric, grounded in colonial assumptions, laid bare the compromises he made before discovering a more expansive vision of human dignity. The turning point in Gandhi's moral journey did not arrive through argument or debate, but through direct exposure to the machinery of colonial violence. By the early 20th century, he had spent more than a decade navigating South Africa's racial order, arguing for Indian rights within its boundaries and appealing to imperial authorities with carefully chosen words. Yet in 1906, during the uprising known as the Bambatha Rebellion, the realities of empire confronted him in a way no petition or courtroom struggle ever had. When the Zulu population rose in resistance against a crushing tax imposed by the colonial government, the response was swift and merciless. Villages were destroyed, bodies were left in the open as warnings, and collective punishment became policy. Gandhi, still believing in loyalty to the British Empire and hoping to demonstrate Indian reliability, organized an Indian stretcher-bearer corps to assist colonial forces. He entered the conflict not as a soldier, but as a medic, carrying the wounded and witnessing the aftermath of repression at close range. What he encountered shook him deeply. The violence inflicted upon African bodies was not an abstract political outcome. It was immediate, physical, and relentless. Gandhi saw men broken by force, communities shattered, and fear used as a tool of governance. For the first time, the suffering of Africans was no longer a distant backdrop to his struggle, but a central moral reality he could not ignore. The empire he had once believed capable of fairness revealed itself as an instrument of domination sustained by brutality. This experience did not produce an instant transformation. Gandhi did not suddenly abandon all his earlier assumptions or emerge as a champion of African political rights. Change came gradually, through reflection and inner conflict. Yet something fundamental shifted. The idea that dignity could be negotiated within a violent system began to feel hollow. The hierarchy he had previously worked within now appeared inseparable from cruelty and dehumanization. In the years that followed, his language began to change. He spoke with greater humility about African labor and acknowledged the essential role African communities played in sustaining South African society. Where he had once relied on comparison and separation, he now showed signs of shared concern. His vision expanded from securing a place for Indians within empire to questioning the moral legitimacy of empire itself. This shift was reflected not only in his words, but in how he lived. Gandhi adopted a simpler life. distancing himself from the privileges that once defined his social standing. He established communal settlements that brought him into closer contact with African neighbors, and he formed relationships based on cooperation rather than hierarchy. These experiences slowly eroded the sense of distance that had shaped his earlier worldview. Importantly, Gandhi did not attempt to speak for Africans or claim leadership over their struggles. He recognized that their fight against colonial rule had its own history, scale, and urgency. Instead, he began to see his own cause as part of a wider pattern of oppression, connected by the same forces of domination and exclusion. Justice, he came to understand, could not be selective without losing its meaning. This period marked the beginning of a broader ethical awakening. The man who had once accepted racial ranking as political reality now grappled with its human cost. The seeds of nonviolent resistance as a universal principle were planted in this realization, rooted not in theory, but in witnessed suffering. Gandhi's later rejection of racism and his insistence on shared human dignity did not emerge in isolation. They grew out of this confrontation with violence and the moral reckoning it demanded. Seen in the context of his earlier actions, this transformation does not erase his past, but it reshapes how it is understood. The Gandhi who emerged after the Bambatha rebellion was still imperfect, still evolving, but no longer willing to view injustice through the narrow lens of communal advantage. It was here, amid the harsh realities of colonial repression, that his journey toward a more inclusive vision of humanity truly began. As Gandhi moved beyond the confines of South Africa and into the global stage, the figure the world came to know as the Mahatma appeared transformed. The language of hierarchy faded from his public voice, replaced by an unwavering rejection of racism in all its forms. He spoke of human dignity as indivisible, of freedom that could not belong to one people while being denied to another. Through campaigns of nonviolent resistance, he demonstrated that moral courage could challenge even the most powerful empires without resorting to force. Across Asia, Africa, and later the United States, oppressed communities studied his methods and drew strength from his example. Yet history, when examined honestly, resists simple conclusions. Modern reassessments do not seek to dismantle Gandhi's achievements, nor to deny the profound influence he had on movements for justice worldwide. Instead, they insist on a fuller picture, one that includes both the man who once accepted racial hierarchy and the leader who ultimately rejected it. This tension does not weaken his legacy, it humanizes it. Gandhi's life becomes not a story of instant moral clarity, but of struggle, contradiction, and growth. By acknowledging his early prejudices, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even those who later stand for justice can begin their journeys shaped by the biases of their time. Gandhi was not born with a universal vision of equality. He developed it slowly, through failure, exposure, reflection, and moral reckoning. His evolution reminds us that ethical progress is rarely linear, and that confronting injustice often requires first confronting oneself. This more complete understanding also changes how we interpret his influence. The power of Gandhi's philosophy lies not in the illusion of perfection, but in the possibility of transformation. If a man once limited by hierarchy could grow into a global symbol of non-violence and solidarity, then change is possible even within deeply unjust systems. His life suggests that moral authority is not granted by purity, but earned through the willingness to learn, to admit error, and to expand one's circle of empathy. At the same time, modern debates surrounding statues and memorials highlight a crucial responsibility. Honoring historical figures should never mean silencing those harmed by their words or actions. Remembering Gandhi fully requires holding both truths at once: the harm caused by his early views and the hope generated by his later convictions. Only then can his legacy serve as a tool for reflection rather than myth-making. In the end, Gandhi's story is not a lesson in blind admiration, but in moral complexity. It challenges us to look beyond symbols and ask harder questions about how heroes are made, remembered, and taught. By facing the whole truth, we do not diminish his message of non-violence, we strengthen it, grounding it in honesty rather than legend. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If this journey gave you a deeper understanding of Gandhi and the complexities of history, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories told with honesty and depth. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive, and your curiosity keeps history meaningful.